around the year 1876, the Texas grasslands were still steeped in deep green. Horses breathed white vapor beside the hitching line, while the camp cook crouched over the red coals, setting a tin coffee pot over the fire and letting bacon grease slowly melt in a cast iron skillet. Movies often remember cowboys with steaks beneath the stars. But a real morning in the West began with hardtack, brown beans, cornmeal, salt pork, and black coffee. Those foods were prepared so a man could be in the saddle before dawn, ride through dust and wind, endure 15 hours of labor, and still have enough strength to make it back. Tonight, the old recipe box is opened once again. The coffee pot is set back over the glowing coals. The cast iron skillet heats in the blue light before dawn. Pull a chair closer to the stove. 25 Forgotten Cowboy Breakfasts begin with number 25. If the memory of this old kitchen reminds you of a cast iron skillet, a mug of black coffee, a batch of hot biscuits, or someone who once knew how to make breakfast from whatever was left, subscribe to the channel. Each week, another recipe card will be opened again. Hardtack, salt fat, and cornmeal over the early fire. Before biscuits had time to rise and turn golden in the Dutch oven, before the pot of beans had enough time to simmer through the night, a cowboy breakfast often began with things that were hard, salty, and hot. A piece of hardtack sat in a wooden crate. A slice of salt pork waited beside the knife blade. A handful of cornmeal was poured into a dented tin bowl. Out on the range, the sky was still deep blue. The cold crept close to the ground, and the fire from the night before had only just been stirred back to life beneath a layer of gray ash. Dish number 25, hardtack soaked in coffee. The piece of hardtack struck the side of the tin cup with a dry sound like stone hitting metal. It was so hard that a man new to the cattle drive could make his whole jaw ache if he tried to bite into it right away. So the cook dropped the hardtack into boiling coffee, waited for the heat to seep through its tiny holes, then lifted it out when the edges began to soften. Around 1870, on the cattle trail stretching from Texas to Kansas, hardtack left over from old military supply depots could be bought for nearly 3 cents a pound. A serving before dawn was usually worth only 1 to 2 cents, and consisted of one piece of hardtack and coffee poured from the chuck wagon's communal pot. The hired hand broke the hardtack with his hands, dipped it again, if the center was still hard, then drank down the crumbs along with the layer of black grounds at the bottom of the cup. On the trail, anything that could still be softened with hot water and patience still had value. The hardtack still waited for the heat. Dish number 24, salt pork and molasses. The smell of frying salt pork rose before the light did. Thin slices of meat lay in the cast iron skillet, their edges slowly curling as clear fat rendered out and made a soft, crackling sound. When dark molasses was drizzled in, the deep-colored sugar met the hot fat, simmered gently, then clung to the surface of the meat with a sweet, salty, smoky aroma. Around 1872, at cattle camps in North Texas, a 10-pound barrel of salt pork cost nearly 90 cents and could last for several days. A meal of a few slices of meat, a little molasses, and day-old biscuits usually cost about 5 to 7 cents. The hired hands ate it with their saddle gear already set beside the hitching post. They stood near the stove, holding a tin plate in one hand and eating quickly before the call to move out rang across the camp. The salt carried their bodies through hours of sweating. The fat stayed in their stomachs for a long time. The little bit of molasses made the morning feel less dry and harsh, salty, sweet, enough to last through the morning. Dish number 23, cornmeal cake cooked on a flat stone. A flat stone was pulled close to the edge of the fire, covered in heat and the glow of red coals. The cook mixed cornmeal with water, added salt, rubbed a thin layer of fat over the stone, then pressed the dough into a flat cake. A faint sizzling sound rose across the grassland, as though the ground itself had just become part of the kitchen. around 1868, along the routes from Missouri toward the Kansas cattle-driving camps, cornmeal cost nearly 2 cents a pound. A cake made from meal, water, salt, and saved fat was usually worth only 1 to 2 cents. The cook used the blade of a knife to turn the cake, waited for the outside to char, then broke it apart while the inside was still dense and hot. The smell of cornmeal mingled with ash, fat, and wood smoke, clinging to the eater's fingertips. When the cast iron skillet was being used for meat or beans, the stone could still hold enough bread for the whole group. Even a hot stone became breakfast. Hardtack, salty meat, and cornmeal had made the hired hands' stomachs feel less empty. Then the entire camp began to stir in the cold air. The lid of the coffee pot rattled over the fire, leftover mush thickened in its mold, and the smell of ham just touching black coffee slowly drew each man out from under his blanket. Black coffee, freed mush, and gravy that woke the camp on some mornings the camp cook did not need to call out. The coffee pot called on its own with the clatter of its tin lid. The grease-filled skillet called with a sizzle against the cast-iron bottom. The smell of ham, mingling with black coffee, drifted through thin blankets, pulling men sleeping on the cold ground back into the new day. Dish number 20. Cowboy coffee with eggshells. The coffee pot boiled hard, dark grounds swirling beneath the eye-stinging steam. Around the year 1875, on chuck wagons traveling between Texas and Kansas, 1 pound of packaged roasted coffee cost about 25 cents. Each morning cup was worth only about 1 to 2 cents, but nearly every hand reached for it before reaching for the reins. The cook poured coarsely ground coffee into the bubbling water, then cracked a raw egg, broken shell, and all into the pot. The egg white clung to the grounds and pulled them down to the bottom, leaving the coffee above clearer and less gritty. The hired hands cradled their cups in both hands, letting the heat soften fingers stiffened by the night dew, then drank as the sound of saddle buckles began to rise near the horse pen. Coffee called men out of the darkness. Dish number 21. Freed cornmeal mush. The night before, the mush had still been soft in the pot. By 4 in the morning, the leftovers had set firm in a mold, ready to return to the grease-filled skillet. In poor camps across the Texas Panhandle around the year 1873, a slice of fried mush added almost nothing to the cost of a meal. Cornmeal was cheap, and bacon grease was kept in a tin hanging beside the chuck wagon. Each serving was usually worth only 1 to 2 cents. The cook had poured the hot mush into a greased mold the evening before. Once the coals were stirred back to life, he cut the mush into thick slices, placed them in the skillet, and fried them until both sides were crisp and golden. The edges firmed up, the outside carried the rich smell of grease, and the center remained soft and warm. If any molasses or a ladleful of brown beans remained, he spooned it over the top, allowing the previous night's supper to enter the new day in a different form. Supper became sunrise. Dish number 20. Red-eye gravy with country ham. When black coffee hit the skillet that had just been used to fry ham, steam rose carrying the sense of salt, bitterness, and smoke. Around the year 1878, on Texas ranches that cured and smoked their own ham, a serving of meat with coffee gravy cost about 8 to 12 cents. It was a substantial breakfast, often reserved for Sunday mornings or days when the work was heavier than usual. The cook fried a thick slice of ham until the fat turned translucent, lifted the meat out, and poured coffee into the hot skillet. He scraped up the brown bits from the bottom and stirred until the coffee and grease separated into a thin gravy, then spooned it over a biscuit split in half. The salty, slightly bitter flavor soaked into the cold biscuit's tender center, reminding a man who had slept outdoors of a distant porch, where breakfast had once passed more slowly and the sound of a spoon touching a plate had felt more familiar. Coffee knew how to make gravy, too. Coffee and skillet grease had awakened the entire camp. But to carry the hired hands beyond the cold morning, the chuck wagon still needed baking powder, sourdough starter, hot bread, and a pot of stew that had been waiting since the night before. Bread reasoning over coals and stew, left overnight. A hot biscuit sometimes carried more than the smell of baked flour. On a cold morning, when horses' hooves were already clattering near the corral, and saddle gear was beginning to be pulled from the wagon, it was a quiet reminder that the workday had arrived, but the hired hands could still step into it with warmth in their stomachs. Behind the camp's chuck wagon, the cook bent over the Dutch oven, using vinegar in place of buttermilk, tending a jar of starter overnight, and drawing an old pot of stew back toward the red coals. Dish number 19. Vinegar biscuits. As soon as the apple cider vinegar touched the milk, a mild sour smell rose from the tin cup. The cook set the cup beside the flour barrel, waited a few minutes for the milk to curdle slightly, and then began the batch of biscuits. Around 1875, on cattle drives along the Chisholm Trail, buttermilk often ran out before the flour did. A small bottle of vinegar, costing about 5 cents, could last through many batches, bringing the cost of each biscuit to only about 1 to 2 cents. He poured the curdled milk into the flour, added fat, salt, and baking powder, then mixed it with fingertips that still smelled of smoke. The dough was patted into a thick layer, cut into pieces, and placed close together in the Dutch oven. Hot coals were spread across the lid. Beneath the black iron, the biscuits slowly rose, their tops turned golden, and the smell of vinegar disappeared into the aroma of baked flour and warm fat. On the trail, the lack of one ingredient often opened the way to another method. The cook understood the temperament of flour, understood the heat beneath a cast-iron lid, and knew that a spoonful of vinegar could save an entire morning. No milk, and the biscuits still rose. Dish number 18, sourdough pancakes. The sound of sourdough batter falling onto the hot griddle was thin and drawn out. Small bubbles slowly rose across the surface of the pancakes, trembling gently before they burst and left tiny round holes in the early firelight. Around 1866, on cattle drive routes associated with Charles Goodnight's chuck wagon, a stack of pancakes for several men cost about 8 to 12 cents. Flour was around 4 cents a pound at the time, but the more valuable part was kept inside the jar of starter, carefully secured to the wagon, shaking with the wooden wheels and surviving each cold night. The evening before, the cook stirred more flour and water into the jar. By morning, he opened the lid, smelled the warm sourness, and ladled the bubbling batter onto the griddle. He waited for the surface to set, watched until all the bubbles had burst, and then flipped each pancake once. The golden pancakes were stacked, then rolled around strips of bacon and placed in a cloth. The hired hands held the pancakes in their hands, eating as they walked toward their horses. Some folded the last one and slipped it into a shirt pocket, carrying a little sourdough and the smell of the cook fire across many miles of grassland. A single sizzle called in the new day. Dish number 17, son of a gun, stew reheated for breakfast. The stew that had sat through the night rested beneath its cast-iron lid. The broth had cooled and thickened, holding within it the smell of meat, fat, chili peppers, and the layer of smoke left from the previous evening's supper. The cook used an iron hook to pull the pot closer to the coals, lifted the lid, and let the first warmth escape into the lingering darkness. Around 1874, after days spent slaughtering calves or branding cattle on Texas ranches, the heart, liver, thymus, marrow, and every other usable part were saved. The meat itself cost almost nothing extra, with only about 5 to 8 cents worth of onions, flour, chili peppers, and fat. The cook could prepare a pot large enough to serve many men. He added a little water or coffee to thin the congealed stew, then stirred slowly as the bottom of the pot heated again. The heart, liver, marrow, and broth blender, dark, thick, and heavy with smoke. When the stew began to bubble, he split a biscuit in half and ladled a full serving over it. For laborers on the old ranches, one animal sustained people through many different parts. Saving everything that could still be used was both an act of thrift and a way of respecting the work that had gone into tending the herd. No part was treated with contempt. Hot biscuits and stew kept men on their feet through the first hours of the day. Then there were also a few rare mornings when the cook poured more fat into the pot, opened a can of peaches, or added meat to the beans. At those times, the voices around the fire grew quieter, because amid a life filled with dust, one decent meal was enough to make the entire camp fall silent for a moment. The meals that made the camp go quiet by the fire. Most mornings on the ranch began with food so familiar that no one even looked up when they were set down. But sometimes, the chuck wagon had just returned from the supply station, the cast iron pot held enough grease, or the wooden crate still contained an unopened can of fruit. On those mornings, the cook could spare a few extra minutes for breakfast. The voices around the fire grew quieter, hands reached out more slowly, and the working day seemed less harsh for one brief moment. Dish number 16, beer sign duff nuts. When the cook announced that there would be donuts that morning, the men sitting around the fire often fell silent and looked toward the cast iron pot. They knew the beef fat was about to turn flour into something rare, golden, hot, and sweet enough to make a man want to eat more slowly than usual. Around the year 1880, in cowboy camps across Wyoming and Montana, a batch made from flour, sugar, sourdough starter, and beef fat could cost between 20 and 30 cents. Divided among the entire group, each donut was worth only a few cents. But some men were still willing to trade several days' worth of tobacco for one more. The cook mixed the flour with sugar, added sourdough starter, and rolled the dough into a thick layer on the floured surface of a wooden crate. He cut out round pieces, made a hole in the center of each one with his fingertip, and dropped them into the fat singing at the bottom of the pot. The dough sank for a moment, then rose, puffed up golden, and turned gently among the bubbles of grease. Each donut was lifted out while its edges were still sizzling, releasing a rich, sweet aroma that made the eyes around the fire grow brighter. The work out on the range was still waiting. The reins still had to be pulled tight. But for a few minutes, the workers were able to eat something made with care rather than simply to fill their stomachs. Even fried dough knew how to comfort. Dish number 15. Canned peaches over biscuits. Golden peach syrup ran over a biscuit that had just been split in half, shining on the tin plate like a piece of summer, opened in the middle of the dusty grasslands. The sweet smell of fruit drifted through the steam of the hot biscuit, completely different from the salt, grease, and coffee that had followed the outfit for weeks. Around the year 1878, at supply stations across the West, a can of peaches cost about 15 cents. It was something the cook had to think carefully about before opening. One can was divided into many servings, so each man received only a few peach slices and a little syrup. But that sweetness often remained in memory longer than the price printed on the can. The cook pried open the lid with the blade of a knife and poured both the peaches and the syrup over the dry biscuits. He broke the biscuits apart so the syrup could soak deep into the centers, held the can tilted for a long time, then used a spoon to scrape away every trace of sweetness still clinging to the bottom. Sugar was too valuable to leave behind, and one soft slice of peach could make a man far from home remember a kitchen table, a garden, and a voice he had not heard in a long time. One can of peaches brought home closer. Dish number 14. Salt pork belly and beans. Salt pork belly frying slowly gave off a heavy, salty, fatty smell. It clung to coats, slipped through blankets that were still being folded, and drifted toward the horse corral. When the brown beans were spooned into the skillet, each one absorbed the hot grease like dry earth taking in the first rain of the season. Around the year 1874, on cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, a 5-pound slab of salt pork belly could cost about 60 cents. A serving of beans cooked with the meat usually cost only about 4 to 6 cents because dried beans were very cheap and just a few pieces of pork were enough to flavor the entire pot. The cook cut the meat into thick pieces and fried it slowly until the fat ran into the bottom of the skillet, then spooned in the beans that had soaked overnight. He stirred them well so they could absorb the grease, added water, covered the pot, and kept the fire low. Over time, the meat shrank into small, salty pieces, the bean liquid thickened, and a thin layer of fat glistened across the surface. The hired hands ate the dish before spending long hours riding, pulling ropes, opening gates, and driving the herd beneath the sun. Sweetness softened the morning, while beans and pork fat kept the body moving farther. Rich beans kept a man going. The small rewards had made the morning gentler, but behind them was still a life that demanded endurance. The next dishes would be stronger, rougher, and meant for days when the body had to rise quickly, no matter how long the night before had been. Raw eggs, hot biscuits, and dried meat for strength. By the middle of the stack of cards, the paper began to smell different. The scent of flour, sugar, and the family kitchen receded, giving way to wood smoke, old grease, and brown stains that looked as though they had once rested too close to the rim of a cast iron pot. The corners of the paper had worn down from being turned by many hands. A few slanting lines of pencil recorded breakfasts meant for men who had to rise while it was still dark, wipe their hands on their shirts, drink a swallow of coffee, and then head toward their horses. The dishes in this section were made for days harder than usual. Some days began heavily after a night in town. On others, the outfit had a long ride ahead. There were also mornings when the fresh meat had run out, while the work in the fields still waited. Dish number 13, raw, prairie oyster. A raw egg rested neatly in a tin cup, its yolk still whole, with vinegar glistening around the edges. The man holding the cup looked down for a moment, took a short breath, and prepared to swallow it whole. Around 1876, at cowboy camps near the Kansas railroad towns, an egg cost about 1 to 2 cents, provided the chuck wagon had managed to keep it intact over the long journey. The cook cracked the egg into a cup, kept the yolk whole, added vinegar, sprinkled in salt, and dripped in a few drops of hot sauce when there was still some left in the spice box. He handed the cup to the man rubbing his forehead beside the wagon wheel. The mixture went down quickly. The cup tipped upward, and the yolk slid down with the sharp sourness of vinegar and a trace of heat lingering in the throat. A few minutes later, the hired hand was bent over fastening his leggings, tightening his saddle straps, and walking out toward the cattle stirring in the mist. One swallow, then back to work. Dish number 12, biscuits baked in a Dutch oven. As soon as the iron hook lifted the lid, white steam poured out, carrying the smell of baked flour and lard. In the cold grasslands, that aroma made the chuck wagon seem for a moment like a kitchen with a roof, a wooden table, and a door shut against the wind. Around 1875, on chuck wagons traveling from Texas to Kansas, a batch of 24 biscuits could cost about 25 to 35 cents. The cook mixed flour with salt, baking powder, lard, and water. He worked the dough lightly with his fingertips, patted it into a round, and arranged the individual portions inside the greased pot. Coals were banked beneath the bottom and then spread evenly across the lid. The cook needed no clock. He watched the color of the coals, listened to the fat crackling around the rim of the pot, and smelled the biscuits to know when to open it. If the bottoms burned too deeply, the whole camp would remember. If the biscuits rose golden, crisp underneath, and soft inside, the men knew the morning had been placed in capable hands. Hot biscuits made the camp feel like home. Dish number 11, pan-fried pemmican. The block of dried meat mixed with rendered fat sat in the palm like a small, dark brick. Its surface was cold and firm, but when it touched the hot skillet it began to soften, sizzled sharply, and released the rich smell of roasted meat and fat. Around 1870, across the Great Plains, hired hands and long-distance travelers had learned to use this durable ration from indigenous traditions and mountain hunters. A pan-fried serving could cost about 8 to 12 cents, more than beans or cornmeal, but it kept for a long time without refrigeration. The cook chopped the block into small pieces, dropped them into a skillet with bacon grease, and used a spoon to scrape and stir constantly. The fat melted out, the meat broke apart, and crisp brown bits formed along the bottom. He spooned the hash over biscuits or placed it directly into tin bowls for the men already waiting beside their horses. The hired hands of that time may never have heard of counting calories. They simply knew which foods kept their feet firm in the stirrups after many hours, and which ones helped them keep their backs straight after the sun had climbed high. Fat was fire inside the body. Eggs, biscuits, and dried meat brought the body back to work. But behind those breakfasts made for difficult days was a steadier rhythm, repeated over many weeks on the trail. It was the pot of brown beans, the skillet of dried meat and potato hash, the loaf of camp bread, and the cast iron pan that rarely cooled completely. Beans, dried meat, and camp bread for long days. Some dishes appeared so regularly that no one needed to cheer when they were served. They were there in the bean pot set close to the coals, in the skillet of potatoes with edges sizzling brown, and in the broad loaf of camp bread large enough for many hands to tear apart. Morning after morning, those foods returned like the clink of horse chains, the opening of a wooden gate, and the sound of boots crossing ground that was still cold. Dish number 10. Chuck wagon style. Brown beans. The pot of beans simmered through the night, making almost no sound except for a few soft bubbles beneath the cast iron lid. The horses slept. The men slept. The red coals quietly carried on with the remaining work until morning. Around the year 1875, in southern Kansas, 1 pound of brown beans cost about 4 cents and was enough to feed several people. A morning bowl of beans with salt pork, dried chiles, and a little grease usually cost only about 2 to 4 cents. The price was small, but the feeling of fullness could stay with a hired hand for many hours. The cook had soaked the beans in water the night before. He added salt pork, a few dried chiles, water, and sometimes a clove of garlic, then set the pot near the coals. Through the night, the beans gradually softened, the brown broth thickened, and a thin layer of grease rose to the surface. When the lid was lifted, the smell of smoke had settled into every bean, mingling with the saltiness of the meat and a mild heat at the back of the throat. The hired hands spooned up the beans with tin spoons, eating while they stood beside the wagon or sat on wooden crates. To them, beans in the morning were as familiar as rains and trail dust. They were cheap, kept well, and were hearty enough to carry the whole group through a long day. Beans knew how to sustain a man for a long time. Dish number 9. Dried beef and potato hash. As soon as the softened dried beef met cold potatoes and hot grease, the smells of onion, salt, and browning potato edges rose from the skillet. The steady scrape of an iron spoon across the bottom of the pan drew those who were still moving slowly closer to the fire. Around the year 1876, 1 pound of dried beef cost nearly 30 cents. Used sparingly, that amount of meat could last for many days. A serving of dried beef hash with potatoes, onions, and grease usually cost about 6 to 8 cents. It was still cheaper than fresh meat and could withstand long journeys. The cook chopped the meat into fine shreds, soaked it in hot water to soften it, then added it to a skillet containing cold potatoes, onions, and bacon grease. He pressed the potatoes against the cast iron surface and waited for the outer edges to brown before turning the meat and breaking it apart. When crisp brown patches formed across the bottom of the skillet, he scraped up every bit and divided the hash evenly among the tin plates. The dish had a deep, salty flavor, with potatoes that were soft in the center and crisp around the edges. When the fresh meat was gone, the dried beef still rested inside its cloth sack, enduring heat, dust, and many hurried mornings. Dried meat still fed the new day. Dish number 8, camp bread. The broad, round mass of dough rested inside the cast-iron pot like a rough plate. Its surface was still pale, but the coals on the lid had begun sending heat downward, gradually spreading the smell of flour and grease around the chuck wagon. Around the year 1878, on ranches in South Texas, where Mexican and American cooks worked side by side, camp bread became a familiar food. One large loaf made from flour, water, lard, salt, and baking powder cost about 8 to 12 cents, enough to tear apart and share among many people before they headed to the horse corral. The cook mixed the flour with lard, water, salt, and baking powder, patted it into a flat round, and placed it in the heated pot. He watched the coals beneath the pot and on top of the lid, listening as the crust gradually dried. Once the outside had turned crisp, the loaf was lifted out and broken into large pieces. Each man folded his bread around brown beans, bacon, or the potatoes left in the skillet. That loaf carried traces of many cooking traditions, many hands, and many years of living together on the frontier. One loaf passed through many hands. Beans, dried meat, and camp bread kept the rhythm of work moving steadily from morning until noon. But amid days filled with dust and the sound of rains, the hired hands sometimes still needed a small taste of sweetness, a simmering cloth sack, or a poor man's pie to remind them that life still held softer moments. A little sweetness before the sun came up. A little sweetness before dawn did not make the rains lighter or the road shorter. But in the moment when syrup ran across the surface of a cake, the pudding bag was opened, or the smell of dried apples and cinnamon spread around the cook fire. Men far from home remembered that life still had its gentler parts. On the cold grasslands, care sometimes took the form of a spoonful of syrup poured slowly, a pastry with its edges folded and sealed, or long hours spent waiting beside a pot of boiling water. Dish number 7, sorghum molasses and licking syrup. The sorghum molasses flowed from the jug in a dark stream, slow and thick like dried grass that had been cooked for many hours. When it touched a hot cornmeal cake, the deep sweetness mingled with wood smoke, making the coarse cake suddenly more pleasant on the tongue. Around 1878, a 1-gallon jug of sorghum molasses or cane syrup could cost nearly 60 cents. When the cook poured it sparingly, that jug could travel with the chuck wagon through an entire long stretch of the journey. Each serving of biscuits, pancakes, or cornmeal cakes with syrup usually cost only about 2 to 4 cents. The cook placed the cake on a tin plate, tilted the jug very slowly so the syrup fell in a small circle, and let it soak into the still warm center. He used a spoon to scrape away the syrup clinging to the mouth of the jug, because every trace of sweetness was precious. White sugar rarely remained on the chuck wagon for long, but sorghum molasses kept well, tasted rich, and carried the flavor of cultivated earth in its glossy brown color. The hired hands broke the cake apart with their fingers, let the syrup stick to them, and licked them clean before taking hold of the saddle straps. A single small spoonful was enough to make a dry, harsh morning feel gentler. A little sweetness kept a man soft. Dish number 6, sweet pudding. In a cloth bag. The tightly tied cloth bag rested in a pot of boiling water for many hours. Outside the bag, the water tapped steadily against the cast iron. Inside, flour, beef suet, molasses, raisins, and dried fruit slowly came together into a dark, heavy, fragrant mass. Around 1880, on Sunday mornings or holidays at camps far from home, a pudding boiled in a cloth bag could cost between 20 and 30 cents. Divided among the entire group, Each serving was worth only a few cents, but the dish required more than money. It required time, a clean cloth, hands that knew how to tie a secure knot, and a cook willing to rise earlier than usual. He mixed the flour with beef suet, poured in molasses, added raisins, and wrapped the mixture in a cloth bag. The mouth of the bag was tied tightly before it was lowered into the pot. The water continued to boil as steam settled over his hair and shoulders. When the cord was untied, the pudding emerged dense and dark, releasing a deep, sweet aroma into the white steam. A slice of pudding did not make the workday any less demanding, but it showed that the cook had thought about the men who were far from home and believed they still deserved a dish made with care. Far from home, sweetness became dignity. Dish number 5. Fried peas filled with dried apples. The dried apple slices lay curled inside the cloth bag like pieces of old paper. After soaking overnight with water, sugar, and cinnamon, they gradually softened, swelled, and released the scent of autumn that had been sealed inside them for many months. Around 1879, at Western supply stations, a pound of dried apples cost nearly 12 cents and could remain in a flour sack for a long time. A batch of fried pies usually cost about 20 to 25 cents, leaving each pie worth only a few cents, but to a hired hand far from home, the smell of apples and cinnamon held an entirely different value. The cook rolled biscuit dough into round pieces, spooned the apple filling into the center, and folded each one into a half-moon shape. He pressed the edges with a fork, lowered the pies into hot lard, and waited for the crusts to turn deep golden brown. The fat crackled around the edges. The apple filling bubbled gently through a small opening, carrying the sweet smell of cinnamon toward the blankets being folded nearby. Fresh fruit could not easily survive the trail, but dried apples could wait inside a bag through many seasons. Once soaked, sweetened, and enclosed in a hot crust, they reminded a man of orchards, front porches, and mornings that had once passed more slowly. Dried apples still remembered autumn. The sweetness softened the camp for a brief moment. But the final 4 dishes would return the story to the heart of the cowboy breakfast, where coarse cornmeal, a living jar of starter, meat from the ranching season, and a cast-iron skillet came together to form a meal strong enough to carry a working man into the dawn. The final 4 dishes and the real breakfast of ranch hands' 21 dishes have carried us through coffee, cornmeal, salt pork, beans, hot bread, skillet grease, and small tastes of sweetness. Now only 4 cards remain in the stack of recipes. The corners of the paper are darker, the pencil marks heavier, as though each dish wants to make clear what the camp cook had understood for a very long time. Breakfast could be rough, but it had to carry a working man out of the darkness and into the new day, with enough warmth in his stomach and enough strength left in his hands to hold the reins. Dish number 4, pan-fried cornmeal pone. The dense cornmeal cakes rested in a saddlebag like small stones. They were firm, heavy in the hand, and able to withstand hours of jostling on horseback. Around the year 1905, when military rations began moving away from this heavy, grease-rich bread, many hired hands on western ranches still kept it as part of breakfast. A batch made from cornmeal, boiling water, salt, and bacon grease cost only about 5 to 8 cents, making each cake worth about 1 cent or less. The cook mixed the cornmeal with salt, poured in boiling water, added grease, and spooned the mixture into a hot skillet. The sound of the batter hitting the cast iron was dry and brief. The outside hardened and the edges turned brown, while the center remained just soft enough to chew, dip into coffee, or sandwich with dried meat. When the day stretched far across the grasslands, a cold cake in a saddlebag still had value, hard, rich, and enough for the long trail. Dish number 3, sourdough biscuits. The jar of sourdough starter was tied inside the chuck wagon like a living thing that needed protection. It shook over ruts in the trail, endured the cold of the night, and still bubbled when the lid was opened the next morning. Around the year 1871, in cattle camps across Montana and along the northern trails, a jar of starter could be kept alive through many seasons. A batch of sourdough biscuits cost about 8 to 12 cents, but its flavor came from time, patience, and the hand that tended it faithfully every day. The cook took 1 cup of starter, replaced it with flour and water, then mixed the living starter with fresh flour. He kneaded it lightly, cut the biscuits, arranged them in a cast iron pot, and covered the lid with coals. Inside, the wild yeast slowly lifted the centers, leaving behind a mild tang and the warm smell of flour. On cold nights, the cook sometimes kept the jar near his bed because a dead starter meant that weeks of flavor would disappear. Living starter kept breakfast alive. Dish number 2. Crispy fried Rocky Mountain oysters. The morning after the calves had been castrated, the camp was usually quieter. In the skillet, slices of meat coated in cornmeal touched the hot grease and changed color quickly. The sizzling rose, then faded into the sounds of cattle out on the range. Around the year 1878, on ranches in Colorado, Montana, and North Texas, this meat came directly from the work of the livestock season, so nearly all of the cost lay in the cornmeal, salt, and grease. 1 serving usually cost only about 2 to 4 cents. The cook cleaned the meat, sliced it thin, rolled it in cornmeal seasoned with salt, and dropped it into the skillet. The coating turned golden and crisp, while the inside softened, and the dish was served with eggs, biscuits, or black coffee. It came from an old ranching principle in which every part that could still feed someone was preserved and treated with respect. No part was wasted. Dish number 1. Bacon, beans, and biscuits. The smell of bacon spread before the sunlight. Brown beans from the night before were spooned into the hot grease, bubbling and filling the skillet with a rich, salty, familiar aroma. Beside it, sourdough biscuits waited on a cloth, while the pot of black coffee continued to steam in the blue shadows of early morning. Around the year 1867, on chuck wagons traveling from Texas toward Kansas, a breakfast of bacon, beans, and biscuits cost about 8 to 12 cents per person. Dried beans and flour were both cheap. Just a few slices of bacon were enough to give the entire skillet grease, salt, and the smell of a working day beginning. The cook fried 4 thick slices of bacon, allowing the grease to pool deep in the bottom of the skillet. He spooned in the brown beans and stirred until the bean broth began to boil and cling to every bean. Then the biscuits were split in half and placed cut side down in the skillet to soak up all the grease and the remaining rich liquid. The hired hands held their plates in one hand and their coffee cups in the other. They ate at 4 o'clock in the morning, saddled up at 4:30, and kept moving until the call for the midday meal carried out from the chuck wagon. This dish stands at number 1 because it gathers the whole life of the West into a single cast iron skillet. The meat provides aroma and grease. The beans keep the stomach full. The biscuits carry the flour, the starter, and the hands of the cook. The coffee pulls a man's eyes away from sleep. Everything has a job to do. The true breakfast of the West. Before the sun rose, they had been fed. The meal was simple, dark, and smoke-stained, but it was enough for each man to step into the new day with warmth in his stomach and his dignity intact. The 25 breakfasts we have just explored were all born from the real lives of people who had to wake before dawn. Hardtack needed coffee to soften. Salt pork left a layer of grease in the skillet. The sourdough starter was kept warm through the night. Brown beans simmered so stomachs would stay full until noon. Biscuits were turned face down against the bottom of the skillet, soaking up the last traces of flavor left behind. At the beginning of the story, the coffee pot was set over glowing coals, and the recipe box opened to a page stained with the dust of the West. Now the fire has burned lower. The hired hands have mounted their horses, The sound of hooves is fading across the grasslands, and the cast-iron skillet remains beside the chuck wagon. Those breakfasts tasted salty, rich, charred around the edges, and rough. But behind them were experience, patience, and the camp cook's quiet way of caring for others. He knew how to save grease, rescue hard bread, keep a starter alive, and turn leftover food into enough strength for another day. If this story reminds you of an old dish, leave its name below. Someone else may remember the same smell of smoke. The recipe box closes. The coffee pot slowly cools, but the smell of bacon, brown beans, and wood smoke before dawn still lingers.